Digitize This Book, what I was arguing, which is a book partly about open access, partly about if you like, digital politics, cultural politics. What I was arguing is that the moment when we transition from one medium to another, so in that case from the writing of print on paper codex books and the publishing of those books, when we transition and we're going to make our work, our writing, our text available online in an open access form, I was arguing that that moment allows us to raise some interesting questions about the sort of questions we should have been raising all along about what a book is, what writing is, what an author, originality, notions of the text, of copyright and intellectual property. So that kind of transition moment that open access allows, or I was writing at the time that it did allow, allows us to raise those interesting, significant questions. My name is Gary Hall. I'm a research professor in the School of Art and Design at Coventry University. I work closely with the media department, part of that department, and my research is mainly in the area of media theory and cultural theory. Okay. And New Cultural Studies was an edited collection that I put together with Claire Birchall, and that was looking at some of the new areas in cultural studies. So there were chapters on the secrecy, on the extreme. We were trying to take cultural studies, if you like, in some new directions. What came out of that was the Liquid Books project, because we wanted to develop that notion of, if we're questioning the notion of the print book, we wanted to explore some different forms that could take. So we launched the Liquid Books series, which is a series of books published online, they're published on wikis that are available for anyone to come along and to re-edit or to rewrite or to remix. And so we kind of wanted to perform the kind of new cultural studies that we were talking about in the New Cultural Studies book. So Liquid Books partly came about because a publisher asked us to follow on from New Cultural Studies and put together a reader, which would have been one thing to do, and in some senses quite sensible. So you can mark down the field and you establish a little brand, but for us it would have been kind of just repeating the same sort of if you like, performance or the same sort of action. So we wanted to take it in a different direction. So we did the Liquid book series, which is making the books much more open, much more literally fluid. So again, so anyone can come along and interact with them. They're much more of a group project, if you like, or they're open to that. One of the things that we then wanted to do was experiment not just with writing, but with more visual. And so one of the projects that came out of that was Liquid Theory TV, and that was experimenting with, if you like, making small little TV programs or videos, not unlike this online. So can we put theory and keep it rigorous, but make it audio-visual, if you like. So we made a series of little, very little programs. One is a film on Deleuze's postscript on the control societies. Another one was on secrecy, and just exploring, can we take theory into those different mediums? Because if we're arguing that we're kind of in a process of transition from the book into something else, we need to explore with those different mediums and those different forms. Liquid Theory TV is a series of, if you like, internet television programs. And where it got most interesting for me was in the subsequent episodes. I think there's been 3 so far, because what we wanted to do, what we found, the first one was a 2-headed interview type format, and we felt very uncomfortable with that for certain reasons, which is, we can talk about why I'm feeling uncomfortable about this situation. So it led us to kind of completely take us out of it. The second version is there's just no representation of us at all, or people. The third one, which is on secrecy, yeah, there's a few actors, and there are some of the people involved in making in that kind of hidden away and doing various roles. So what that led me to go then on to explore is the role, if you like, of the individual author or the theorist or the philosopher in creating and publishing and disseminating philosophy or theory, and how we're very much encouraged for the individual author to become very present in that, and what that means. So that's led me to thinking about the next project, which is Pirate Philosophy. The main form of that, if you like, or one form, I shouldn't say the main form, is a book that's not too far away from being published, hopefully. So that's going to be a book where I'm engaging with a number of, if you like, radical thinkers, people like Bernard Stiegler or Rosie Braidotti, and thinking about how they perform, what it is to be, if you like, a critical theorist or a continental philosopher, which is not just to do with what they're writing and what they're publishing, but it's to do with the way that they act, the way that they work, their kind of almost their business, if you like, their performance of that kind of a role. Perhaps the best way to explain what I'm thinking about in terms of pirate philosophy is if you think of what Foucault says in The Birth of Biopolitics, and he's talking about liberalism as a system, and what he's talking about there is not liberalism just as a philosophy or a way of thought. He's talking about liberalism as a practice. And so what I'm exploring is the way that we may have, anti-liberal or anti-neoliberal philosophies derived from Marx, or if you like, Latour or Deleuze or Donald Haraway. We may have those theories that we work with in the content of our work, but the way that we actually act as theorists or philosophers is quite liberal. So we have a very liberal notion of the individual, proprietorial human author, liberal notions of copyright, of creativity, of originality. So what I'm trying to explore in the book is, how can we think through that? What would it be to not adhere to that kind of liberalism in the way that we actually act and think and work as philosophers? That relates very much to the classical definition of the pirate that comes from the Greek and Roman world. So one of the things I do want to question with that is notions of intellectual property and copyright, but I don't want to just flip over into a dialectical opposite as we're all going to be now thieves, it's all going to be illegal. What I'm actually trying to question is the relationship between good and bad, and illegal and illegal. And what's interesting about the original definition of where the etymology of piracy comes from is the world of the ancient Greeks, and there the word for pirate is related to that for someone that makes an attempt, someone that trials, someone that puts something to the test. So that's what I'm trying to do. The world is, it defines piracy in terms of fluidity. So the Roman philosopher Cicero defines a pirate as someone that does not belong to a fixed polity, a polity that's a community that's tied to the land. So a pirate then is someone that's outside of that lives a much more fluid life. Now, if we bring that back into our time, what I'm interested in that, obviously, linking back to projects such as the Liquid Books or the Liquid Theory TV, what does it do for our understanding of the way that we work, the way that we write, the way that we think, the way that we understand theory and philosophy, if we understand that as much more fluid and not quite as fixed. So one argument would be that modernity The industrial mass production of texts, of ideas, of knowledge is kind of just a blip. So before that time, leading up to Shakespeare's time, when an author would send a text to the printer would feel quite open to altering that text, to adjusting it. So text there was still seen as being quite fluid. It was something that people could alter. If you go back to one of the two first Bibles that we have in existence, that's got something like 30,000 corrections in it and revisions in it, and some of them are really, really important revisions in it. So texts have always been fluid. We've just had a moment around modernity where we thought the texts weren't fluid, that they were kind of fixed. What's interesting with the move from print to other forms of media is we may be coming out of that. It won't be the same. It won't be the same as in Shakespeare's time. It'll be different, but texts will be more fluid. We will be able to work with them, rework with them, remix them. There's a common expression around that. So we're exploring what that means for how we understand what it is that we do as philosophers, as theorists, even as artists. In keeping with that notion of fluidity and liquidity, or things being in process, would be another way of thinking about that. I wouldn't be trying to work this, if you like, I'm calling it pirate philosophy, into some master philosophy that I will then repeat endlessly, that would then become my kind of trademark or my brand, if you like. What I'd be looking to do, and I do this with a number of ideas and concepts, I would use it for temporarily for a little while, and then I would move on to something else. So I have talked about liquidity in the past. We've been through a whole series of different concepts. We've done liquid books, we've done living books, now talking about piracy. Another way of thinking about some of these things would be in terms of the post-humanities, or the inhuman, or the inhumanities, if you like. And along with that, I also try not to just work as a single individual theorist or philosopher. So a lot of the projects that we're involved in are group projects. So it would be like the Culture Machine journal, Culture Machine Live podcast series. It would be Open Humanities Press and all the projects surrounded around that. It would be the Centre for Disruptive Media at Coventry. So all of these things are working with groups, collaboratively, collectively, to try to get away from this notion that we're still in this romantic version of the individual, humanist, liberal author as some sort of creative genius that can produce these ideas, this work, this thinking in isolation. So some of the projects we do are collective. Some of them I do have a certain persona of an individual author or writer or theorist. Others would be done anonymously, all different, just to try and not settle it down into one fixed form, and to raise questions for what it is that we're doing with this new medium. This partly explains why I was uncomfortable about a situation like this, because, and it's a very common situation, we don't get invited to speak or attend conferences or give talks as a group, where the participants in these various projects all tend to get invited individually. Now and again we'll get one or two of us, but would never be as a larger group. And I understand partly because of money and funding and all those sorts of issues, but in our culture we're very much individualized. We're all here as individual talking heads. So if we're moving into this new world of new media, is one very large way of describing it. It shapes us in a different way than the way that the book does, but it's still shaping us. So things like Facebook, Twitter, social media, social networks, they're shaping us to be individual entrepreneurs of ourselves, as Foucault would talk about in terms of what neoliberalism does to us. Neoliberalism turns us into enterprises, but we're enterprises of ourselves. So we're supposed to be always out there on Facebook and on Twitter or on Academia EDU. We're all out there publicising ourselves and promoting ourselves and branding ourselves in relation to this network. We're trying to turn ourselves into micro celebrities. We're under this regime where we're always, everything's being counted. It's almost like we're all individually being audited. How many hits can we get? It doesn't matter what we're actually saying, as long as we get enough hits, we get enough likes, we get all of this, and this too is shaping us. What I'm interested in when academics talk about this new media is they tend to forget the media that shapes them. So for me, books, journal articles, the university, this is all media too. What happens is when academics and thinkers like myself talk about these things, they don't focus on that. They'll look at the BBC, they'll look at Twitter, they'll look at algorithmic surveillance, and they'll say, yes, look, that's happening, we can see this, and we need to really study this is important. But where we're coming from, that notion of subjectivity that we're coming from, that is being changed by this new media, I think that's important too. And academics too often forget that, and they almost have this liberal subjectivity as a default. And what I'm interested in is both of those forms of subjectivity. So what I'm interested in is ways of thinking and acting and working that don't simply slip into either of those kind of two notions of subjectivity, or those two roles, if you like. The kind of classical author divides, from romanticism, where I'm going to just disappear into a study and just individually create with a pen in my hand this text, or that now I'm going to be out there on the networks and I'm going to be connecting and building a persona or building a community using Twitter and Facebook. What I want to do is fit into neither of them. I want to explore the possibilities for neither of those, which is one of the reasons why I think we need to be aware of the kind of thing that we're doing here. This is again something that we're doing using new media and digital cameras, and it'll go online, but again it's just me as an individual talking head. There's no sense of any of the groups that I work with. There's no sense of collaboration or collectivity. We're not kind of making that visible here. And we could get into, if you wanted to get into contemporary theories of new materialism or post-humanism, there's no sense of me being connected to a whole environment that makes this possible, where the materials came from your camera, and the shipping costs and the environmental damage. There's none of that enacted in this particular format, which is not unlike your work. It's not just about talking about it or writing about it. For me, unless we can actually explore that, what Marshall McLuhan would call this kind of new galaxy, this post-Gutenberg galaxy, unless we can explore it, it's very hard for us to just think about it. Too often we tend to think about it while pretending we live in the Gutenberg galaxy. We're trying to write about Twitter or Facebook or Google as if we're still in the pre-Google galaxy. We're in the Gutenberg galaxy. No, we're not. We're in another galaxy. Or we're moving, and in fact for McLuhan it's precisely that moment of transition that enables us to see that we are in a process of transition. You can almost make out the shape of the two different galaxies, but we have to kind of explore it and not just let ourselves be carried away with it, so that I'm going to turn myself into a micro-celebrity or a self-entrepreneur. How can we do that in ways that don't do that? Which is why I've been very awkward, and I wouldn't sit with a bookcase of books behind me, why I insisted on talking about my discomfort about just being an individual talking head. So I've been talking about feeling a certain discomfort in performing in certain ways. At the same time, while withdrawing or being absent or absenting yourself from those kind of networks or those media forms is one strategy that it can be usefully employed at certain points. So people often want to boycott a certain publisher or organisation if they're not operating in the way that people are happy with. If you are absent entirely, it's not that the system then breaks down. What happens is that space, that gap, is just then filled with something else, someone else who might say things that you're not happy with. So sometimes you do have to kind of perform in these certain roles, trying to do it in a way that is that there's not such a huge contradiction or distinction between what you're saying and thinking about and articulating and the way that you're doing it. So if we're moving from this Gutenberg galaxy to a post-Gutenberg galaxy, that raises all sorts of issues around our notion of ourselves. So one of the arguments is that in the Gutenberg galaxy we develop our sense of notion of the private and the public, because when books became printed on a larger industrial scale, people needed to have private spaces where they could disappear, they could read the books, they could really concentrate on those books, and that gave us our notion of the private individual self, which people didn't necessarily have before that. So we can see how subjectivities change, our notion of the individual, our notion of the relationship between the private and the public. Now as we're moving out of that, we can see something different happening, and which is where you get all the fuss around Facebook and it's changing its privacy settings, and is this impinging on our notions of privacy? Well, it is, in terms of those that were derived from the book, and you can see that in very obvious ways in the way that libraries are changing. So libraries are much more public organisations. They're not quiet, they're not full of quiet spaces. Sometimes they still have those, but they're becoming more like coffee shops. People are in there, they're chatting, they're talking to their friends, they're working in groups. If you go and then look at coffee shops are kind of a bit more like libraries. People are in there working on their laptops, they're connected with all these different, via electronic media, digital media. Now one of the narratives with that is that we're all a lot more distracted. So we used to go and then really focus and concentrate in the Gutenberg galaxy, but now that we've moved out of that we're much more distracted, that we can't focus and that we can't concentrate. I'm suspicious of that narrative. What I worry about is that we're seeing that just from that very classical liberal notion of how we're, that literate, that book-based notion of what it is to be a thinker or an academic, where we're kind of used to doing that. I'll be very wary of setting those two things up as in some sort of an opposite ends of a spectrum, or a continuum, if you like.